Here is your host, Wendy Covey.
Hi, and welcome to Content Marketing Engineered. I'm your host, Wendy Covey. On each episode, I'll break down an industry trend, best practice, or challenge in marketing to technical audiences. Along the way, you'll meet friends and colleagues of mine who will share their stories. And my hope is that with each episode, you'll be inspired and ready to take action. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief shout out to our sponsor, True Marketing. True is a full-service content marketing agency located in beautiful Austin, Texas. For more information, visit truemarketing.com. If you are thinking about starting a B2B podcast, you'll want to learn some shortcuts so you can get started quickly and learn from those who've been there before you. And that's why I'm so excited about today's episode. You'll hear from Alban, Brooke, who is the head of marketing for Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout's whole business model is offering software for podcasters. And I first found Alban because I was searching on how to start a podcast, and he has a whole podcast about podcasting. And anyway, there's lots of great tips in this episode, so I know you'll enjoy it. Let's get started. So I'm here with Alban Brooke, head of marketing at Buzzsprout, and we're going to talk all things podcasting. Thank you for being here, Alban.
Thank you for having me, Wendy. I'm excited.
All right. Well, before we dive in, I have got to ask, what in the heck inspired you to go into marketing after becoming an attorney? What the heck?
Oh, well, I mean, the practice of law inspired me to do something else. I don't think
no.
I mean, it was a pretty quick, I think I only practiced law for a year and a half, and it was a pretty quick realization. I was like, oh, this is definitely not the world that I was hoping it was going to be. You're not fighting all these great justice cases. You're fighting which multinational company gets more of the $50 million. So it wasn't really life-giving. And then I found an opportunity to move in technology, which was what I was more excited about. And yeah, that's what helped me make the switch.
And here you are at Buzzsprout. And, some listeners may not know about your company. So before I have you give us the elevator pitch, I want to share with you how I found Buzzsprout. So not too long ago, I started this podcast and I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I went on to Apple and I Googled how to start a podcast. And I think you probably know what I landed on.
Is it something that had too many photos of me on it?
Maybe. So a podcast on how to start a podcast, perhaps. And it was great. And so every day I'd go to the gym and I'd listen to an episode or two, and then I would have to stop the rowing machine and take notes and write things down. And before you knew it, I had everything I needed to get started. And it was like my Bible. So thank you for that.
That is such a, thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that I love is we've done YouTube videos of the same content that we did the podcast, teaching people how to podcast. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you how much more often I hear from people, I listen to your podcast versus I watch your YouTube video. But I know the numbers are on YouTube, we have about 6 times as many plays.
Wow.
But the people who actually commit to podcasting and I actually speak to are disproportionately the podcast speakers. And I think it's just it really leans into what I believe is unique about podcasting itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and for me, I thought, who better to trust than someone who has an established podcast teaching me about podcasting, and then I'm enjoying listening to, you know what I mean? So it's like, okay, you're eating your own dog food, so to speak, you're putting your best practices into action. And so it gave me a higher level of trust. So home run for content marketing, gaining new customers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's awesome to hear.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, could you give us a brief synopsis of what Buzzsprout is all about?
Sure. Buzzsprout is the easiest way to start a professional podcast. We're trying to take as much of the tech out of your hands and give you powerful tools so you can get your message out to the world. So we do everything from you record and edit your episode. As soon as that's done, you pass it to us. We're going to help you get into directories. We're going to help you promote it on social media. We're going to help you master the episode. And then we're going to give you great stats so that you can track the performance of your podcast. But over the years, we've been podcasting since 2009. And so over the last 11 years, we've just grown out more and more tools to try to make it as easy as possible.
And it really is. I'll tell you, I'm a HubSpot agency partner. And to me, as soon as I learned about Buzzsprout, I was like, oh, it's like the equivalent of what HubSpot does for me in so many other areas of content marketing. And, once I was educated on how difficult it is to put your podcast on each different media channel and the nuances of even getting the artwork sized right, I was like, oh, heck, I need somebody else to do this for me. So very cool.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of HubSpot that I love so much, how well they do content marketing, how they've structured their business. And there's quite a bit of the DNA of HubSpot that's made its way, at least into the marketing of Buzzsprout, because I go to Inbound every year and I, really love everything they've done.
Interesting. Well, let's dive more into that. So you lead Buzzsprout's marketing efforts. So that's pretty cool. What is your approach to content marketing?
My approach to content marketing is the internet allows us to do something unique, which is put an ungodly amount of effort into making one piece of content, and we can actually be paid outsized returns on that content.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe before the internet, you really had to make sure if you're going to spend a day making a pamphlet that you would get enough for people to read it. And now with the internet, we can spend, and we have spent, weeks on a single piece of content. And at the end, it actually ranks number one in Google, and it brings us tons of quality leads. And it's something really incredible because you have the opportunity basically to make the number one piece of content in the world for something. And it's a really powerful thing when you're able to create something of that high quality. And the internet just allows you for that to actually make sense financially.
Yeah, such a change, a game changer. I remember, not to date myself, but my first job was planning trade shows for a technical company, and then and that was in the late '90s. And then when the web came about, all of the media departments adopted their own counterparts online. So trade shows and seminars became webinars. And so I started doing these webinars, and wow, the efficiency and quality and, cost per lead, quality per lead, it was ridiculous. And it was so easy to, produce that type of content compared to doing trade shows and physical seminars. So I know what you mean.
One of my favorite stories about the transition from in-person media to podcasting, one of my friends actually sets up conferences, and he runs one of the largest podcasting conferences. His name's Chris, and he does Podfest. And he set up this whole big event. He spent 2 weeks organizing it. Maybe 50 people came. And he got up there and spoke to everybody and went, this was a successful, thing that I did. And at that event, he talked to somebody, and his friend said, I'm shutting down my podcast. I never got any listens. Chris is like, oh, what, so what kind of downloads were you getting? He's like, I don't know, 300 a month or 300 an episode. And Chris was like, wait a second.
Why would you shut that down?
Why would you shut that down? Because
yeah.
I'm spending 2 weeks to get 30 minutes of FaceTime with these 50 people. You're putting in a couple hours a week, and you're getting 300 people to come and listen to you intently, and they really care about what you have to say. Mm-hmm. And when he put it in that perspective, he's like, if you were thinking of those as real people, wouldn't you show up every week? And the guy was like, whoa, okay, this is actually a great thing for me to be doing. But there's something about the internet that it's almost like we don't trust that those numbers are even real people. But when we start to actually trust it and go, okay, that's real, then we see the power of distribution to so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so is that one of the ways then of how you consider podcasting to be pretty unique among other channels?
Yeah. So if you think about all the different content marketing channels we have, podcasting is actually one of the hardest to grow. And it's one of the channels where you'd expect to get less listeners than you would somewhere else. So like I shared, where we have our How to Start a Podcast course, I have that as a blog. I have that as a video series on YouTube, and then I have it as a podcast. The blog's been read over 1 million times. The videos have been watched over 500,000. And I think the podcast itself is over 100,000, but it's not a lot more than 100,000. And so those numbers really drop off.
Huh.
But the level of trust that podcasting can create with your audience is really incredible. So we go to conferences and I almost never have somebody say, "Oh, I feel like I know you. I've been watching your YouTube videos." They almost always say, "I feel like I know you. I've been listening to the podcast." And that always kind of struck me, that I was like, that's weird, because it's a factor of 5 more people have watched. And then I spoke with somebody who does a lot of YouTube content, and he said, well, the reason is because on YouTube, we expect 3 to 4 minutes of watch time of video. But on podcasting, it's very common to get someone to listen to you for 25, 35 minutes.
Boy, that's a good point.
And so what is your business? How is it built? Is it built to rather have 10 people pay attention to you for 3 to 4 minutes, or for one person to spend 30 to 40 minutes with you? And so I think the amount of time someone's actually spent listening to us is much greater on the podcast side, even though those numbers are quite a bit smaller. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And so when people launch their podcast apps, and if they're anything like me, they're getting ready to run the neighborhood or get on the rowing machine, and I've set aside that time and I want to listen to something that's long. I want to learn something. I have goals for that time. Whereas I do see that with YouTube, there's lots of distraction around the screen, right? Things are being served up the whole time that you're watching. And you just tend to be more, distracted. Yeah.
There's something I like to preach, that there's no casual fans in podcasting, because it's hard to get people to listen. And I gave a talk at a conference and I asked everyone, raise your hand if you've ever grabbed somebody else's phone, downloaded a podcast app, and subscribed. And over half of the podcasters raised their hand because they knew they'd done that. And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. We are educating all these people on how to use podcasts. Whereas YouTube, somebody just doesn't feel good on a Saturday, and they sit there and they scroll through for hours, and they dip into a conspiracy theory, and then they watch some music, and then they watch some news, and then they watch you for 30 seconds, then they move on.
Yeah.
And it's kind of almost, they're just dipping into different things. It's not as intentional as, I'm going to the gym and I'm going to listen to this because I want to do something new. And I sought this out.
Yeah. Well, I'm very curious. So a lot of marketers start with a core piece of content and then they'll repurpose it into different assets, right? And so when it comes to your podcast and your blog and your YouTube channel, where do you start and where do you repurpose?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So we always have started with, you need to start with the research. And so mostly it's we're seeing questions come in through support or through our Facebook group, or ones we actually just solicit. Mm-hmm. And then we do a lot of research saying, okay, what's the actual right answer to this? And how do we give a complete answer? And then the easiest thing to do then is to create a blog, because a blog can always be updated very easily. You do something and then people write in, they say, hey, that's not technically correct, or you could have fleshed out, the second section a bit. And so we have the opportunity to revise. So we do the blog first, and then we often will go into creating podcast episodes. And then we would go into video, just kind of like stepping up how final each of those things are. It's very hard, to make an edit to a video that's just about to go get published. You're going back and you're re-rendering everything. But what we have started doing now is we do that podcast and that video segment in tandem. So we write the script, and one of us will actually use a teleprompter, read it. We'll put all the graphics into the video, but we always record with the idea that this should be able to stand alone as a total audio piece. So then we publish that audio on our podcasts and we publish the video on our YouTube channel. So it's a nice way for us to test things in the blog content world and then to create 2 more pieces of content to put out on the other channels.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's interesting. I think everyone does it a little bit different. I think we're all figuring it out. When it comes to businesses, so as you know, my audience listening are people working in technical companies. So think of this in, design and manufacturing and test. Are these good candidates? This type of really technical companies for starting a podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what podcasting really allows you to do is there's a lot of this knowledge that you really can only learn by speaking to the small amount of people that actually know about it. So very technical fields where things may not be published online, or very kind of high level discussions where people aren't writing it in books. And so sometimes you might see a tweet or two that seem kind of helpful, or a blog post. But there's just a lot of stuff that you kind of have to work for somebody who's an expert in a field. Well, what podcasting allows you to do is to kind of have those just random conversations. And instead of just having it with one person that works for you or one person that you work for, now that those conversations get to be broadcast to anybody who wants to learn. And so there's a lot of really, really advanced technical fields where people are just having conversations about really advanced SEO tactics that they're using. And that anyone who's on the level where they go, oh, that would be helpful for me, they can just opt in to those conversations. Another reason why it's really good for technical fields is, especially for people who are doing some sort of, their clients are mostly long life cycle to actually land a new client. The amount of trust you can build up in podcasting makes that such an easy sell. So you're getting somebody to opt into your podcast. They listen to you possibly they've listened to you after a handful of episodes for 10 hours. Talk to them. And they know that you're an expert. And so now they don't feel the need to check in with 5 different salespeople. They just go directly to you, say, I want to work with you. And now let's have the discussion.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, all of that work was done in the past when you created the podcast. And now you have people showing up asking, to hire you.
Yeah. And I think what you said there really applies not only to podcasting, but across content marketing, right?
Oh,
Utilizing content to build credibility and build trust and connect with that prospect. And boy, with these technical audiences, it really does work. The generosity of sharing that technical knowledge does come back in spades. And it tends to be a longer sales cycle too. So the idea of having this education and something to keep bringing people back during that, whatever it is, design phase, production phase, that it helps greatly. So that's great.
One of my favorite
yeah.
stories on this is we have a podcast that the host, he sets up call centers for big companies.
Okay.
And so that's really specialized knowledge. And, it takes a lot of work. No client is going to hire him for something small. Everything is a really big contract. And so he started a podcast where he was just going through and talking about everything. He's saying, hey, if you're setting it up yourself, here's the types of systems you could consider. Here are the ways to hire. Here's what to do when you find out that people aren't meeting their call quotas, whatever it may be. And he's just giving away all of that knowledge that's really hard to learn yourself. And so what happens is all these companies, when they hire they have someone internal who's kind of heading up the call center for a bit. They start listening to his podcast. And eventually they go, okay, this thing has gotten pretty big. We know we want to do it. And I've been listening to this podcast now for weeks. I know where we want to go to hire somebody. And he said that he was only getting something like 250 plays per episode, but he was getting almost all of his leads started coming through the podcast because he was reaching the 250 people in the United States that he really needed to reach, the people who were decision makers in their companies on who to hire to run a call center. And so he became the expert. He's now speaking at conferences. And at the end, he said, clients that he chased for years have now started coming to him just because the perception of what he's doing has changed.
Interesting. Yeah. So, it sounds like part of the magic there was how specific he was he wasn't talking in generalities and being fluffy, right? It was very specific, practical advice that kept people coming back and demonstrated his knowledge. And he wasn't fearful of giving away all his secrets, because at the end of the day, the people that hired him, they don't want to do it themselves. They want to understand how all the parts work, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge or time to do it themselves. So
yeah, I think you just said that perfectly. You can, with content marketing, you can be very afraid. Well, if I give away the recipe, no one will ever have to come to my restaurant. They'll just make the food at home. And you think that that's true. But what happens is you give away all of the information. You teach people how to do things themselves. And two things happen. One is they trust that you know what you're talking about, and you build up a lot of goodwill. And then two, they realize how difficult it really is going to be. And that's helpful for them because they realize how difficult it's going to be at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they see how difficult it is, they go, you know what? It would be easier to hire somebody to run my call center. It would be easier to hire this company to help me start a YouTube channel or whatever it may be. As long as you're teaching, people are going to eventually, a subset of the people you teach will come to you and say, please, can you show me, can you just do this for me? You look like you've got it all together and I've got a business to run.
Yeah, really full circle back to the beginning where I said, because of listening to your podcast, I learned how to, upload my podcast onto each media channel and resize the little tiles. And by the time I heard that whole episode, I was like, forget it. I want a software that does this for me, a software solution. So anyway, very cool. Well, I've heard a lot about best practices and all these things of what to do with podcasts, but tell me, do you have one or two pieces of advice or stories of failure when there's been an absolute just like train wreck of a podcast?
I mean, over half of podcasts end that way. So it's maybe not one or two. I mean, I give you lots of general things to stay away from. Sometimes people dive in with the biggest red flags for us are questions that come in the beginning along the lines of what types of podcasts are the most successful and what should I be podcasting about?
Oh my.
And what that tells me is the thing that's attracted you to podcasting is the opportunity to be famous, or you have the illusion that you're going to make a lot of money off podcasting.
Right. Like little kids on YouTube, the sixth graders that think they're going to be millionaires filming themselves gaming or something.
Right. And those are possible that you're buying a lottery ticket. Your chances of that happening are not good.
Yeah.
What is really powerful is when you have a message that the message is going to resonate if you were able to connect to the right people. And now that you're starting a podcast. The podcast is just the medium to get this message to people. And so whatever you could teach them is what you need to have a passion for. So one, you've got to be passionate for whatever you're going to be podcasting about. Mm-hmm. People getting overly nervous about publishing right perfectly the first time. And I've gone to conferences where I've met people with really good ideas and they already have a couple solid interviews, like well-known people interviewed and ready to go. But they don't want to publish because they still want to tweak.
Oh,
and
it's hard right at the beginning.
But the only reason we do that is because we're nervous that we're going to look silly.
Yeah.
And we are going to look silly. That's just the way it is. Your first blog post was not that great. Your first video was not that great. I mean, maybe I should say me. My first blog post was not good. My first videos were not good. All of that, we only got better by spending about a year testing things, figuring out what worked, and then starting to build a process. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people want to have the perfection down before they ever launch. And it's just not going to happen.
No. And you know what? It's a good time to be authentic with everything going in the world. And even besides that, our culture, I think, has changed too. So, if a pet walks in the room or a kid or whatever it is, these days, it's just part of life. So I'm with you to encourage people to just put themselves out there and not worried about being perfectly polished. Lord knows I'm not at all.
And if you ever have any misgivings about it, go listen to the early episodes of some of your favorite podcasts.
Oh, right.
So, I started listening to Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, and his first episodes are kind of painful compared to what he does now. And Pat Flynn, his first episodes are pretty rough compared to what he's doing now. And I've had many people come back and say that advice actually helped me a lot, because I went and listened to, and they name a podcast I'd never listened to. And they go, and you're right, the first episodes were pretty rough. And it really helps people open up to, okay, very few people are going to be listening in the beginning. Just consider like a soft launch for a restaurant. You don't have to advertise the podcast. Just go ahead and start getting it out there, and then do it for a couple months and don't advertise it at all. And then be like, okay, I've kind of found my voice. If you're truly embarrassed, delete the back catalog, but you won't be. And you'll just be getting better. And then do all the marketing and start pushing people to the podcast.
Yeah. Great advice. Well, listen, I could go on and on because I'm in my first year and you have so much wonderful advice. I could interview you all day, but in being respectful of your time, before we go, what resources do you have where our listeners can go to learn more?
So if you go to Buzzsprout/how-to-make-a podcast, I think you can probably just search Buzzsprout and then click the link.
I promise you can. I found it. Just Google that. I'll put it in the resource part of my blog, though, just in case.
So that page is a really good launching off point. We have an email course there. We have the entire everything you need to know in about 5,000 words, walking through everything with podcasting. We have 8 videos that walk you through each section. And like you found, we have a podcast that you could listen to.
It's awesome.
Each of those are full courses in of themselves. So whichever of those, mediums works best for you and your lifestyle. If you're a visual learner, you've got YouTube. And if you like to read like me, you've got the blog.
Yeah.
Go find whichever one works for you and, just dive in.
And I also want to mention, I found on your blog somewhere a great research report talking about adoption of podcasting and which channels are most popular and what the trends have been over time. And, we here over in the engineering space are big on data. So for those listening that want to see some data behind what the trends are to share with executives to maybe get behind funding podcasting, that's another good resource to go find.
Yeah, so we have a whole page on podcasting statistics. And then one of our engineers, John, did a whole talk diving into tens of millions of plays to pull out all the 2020 podcasting trends.
Yeah, I think that's the one I saw. He was in a conference room or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so he just
a good one.
That was a talk I think that he gave at Podcast Movement.
Okay.
And so he also gave it in Jacksonville, and we filmed it for that. But yeah, I think that that gives you, if you need a little bit of backing to push someone in your industry or in your office to kind of back a podcast, that's a good, that might be a good thing to watch. But I would warn you, it's, maybe this might be a good thing to end on. When we think about all this content marketing and the idea of, kind of our content funnel, mm-hmm. and we're trying to drive, people just from awareness of the brand to actually being an advocate. Podcasting, people often think like YouTube or social media, it's up at the top. It's where we're building awareness, but it's really where we're taking people to a much deeper relationship with the brand. And so those are conversations that could be a little bit silly and go off on a tangent that show more of the personality of the company. They're not as polished. And what it does is it allows people to feel a little bit more of a genuine connection with you. But that also means the number of people that will be interested will be diminished, but that's not a bad thing. It's just, it's a deeper connection with a fewer amount of people. Mm-hmm. And so where your YouTube might be, it's for a little bit of a different audience.
Yeah. So perhaps engagement metrics such as the time listened would be a better metric than looking at the total numbers of subscribers.
Yeah. And being honest with yourself that maybe what you're doing is you're not helping your sales team land new leads. You might be nurturing those leads so that when they show up to the sales team, that they're already ready to buy. And you can put a lot of calls to action in a podcast without making them calls to action. You can start saying things like you teach something and you say, and if you would like help with this, just reach out to me at X email. And when people reach out, you'll know where they came from and you can pass them over to your sales team, but they will be, a much hotter lead. It'll be someone who's ready to make a purchase versus somebody who you may have reached out to yourself.
Yeah. Excellent ending advice. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Alban. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
Visit contentmarketingengineer.com for notes and resources from today's episode. While there, you can subscribe to my blog, which will keep you up to date on new episodes and other resources for building trust and growing your business with technical content. Thanks and have a great day.